Stand by for a rare treat, an everyday story of rehearsal folk.
OK then, light coming after the sig.
There we are. There's your mum and there's your little sister. That's right.
Right, thank you. Just 1 second. Can we have less of the lambs bleating?
Well, the background
The
ones.
background lambs. Because they sound a bit science fiction-like to me. And the lamb bleating in the foreground, can that come in a bit earlier? Yeah. Have we a bit of straw in studio, David? Right, OK. Yes, we'll take that.
The grand celebratory version of the best-known signature tune on radio, Barwick Green by Arthur Wood. For 30 years it's introduced The Archers, the world's longest-running radio serial, the programme everyone knows. Some people hate, others love to hate, and some of us just love. For 15 minutes every weekday, a whole hour on Sundays, we Ambridge appreciators contrive to find ourselves alone with the radio, waiting to find out what's going to happen next. There are, they say, 6 million of us every week, and oddly enough, the audience is getting younger. You'd be surprised at just what sort of people listen and why. For instance, dramatist Micheline Wander.
I have a sneaky feeling that part of the fascination with the Archers is to do with being prepared to recognise that there's some element in all of us that really wants to escape into some kind of idealised world, not because we don't believe it's possible, and very often because we do believe it's possible and we want it to become more possible, but just because it can be really quite constructive, even if you know it's not like the life you're going to face when you switch the radio off.
Someone else who turns out to be an Archers fan is the award-winning novelist and playwright Susan Hill. She's also written scripts for it and found it, in some unexpected ways, an instructive experience.
When people knew that I was doing it, we lived in Oxford. We now live in a little village, not unlike Ambridge, outside Oxford, but at the time we lived in Oxford. And I came across academics, Oxford dons, people who you would expect to be discussing philosophy and politics and molecular sciences, or to make small talk about which Oxford school your children were going to. But the most unlikely people said, I hear that you're writing The Archers. Not of course that I ever listened, but tell me, who is Shula going to marry? But what was really extraordinary was my poor husband would go to dinner, perhaps in a college, and sit next to a historian or a molecular physicist, and they'd say, excuse me, am I given to understand that you're Susan Hill's husband? Tell me, in The Archers, is she going to make the vicar, and so on and so on?
And here's another writer, critic and dramatist who finds himself curiously caught up in the Ambridge dream stream. Last year, in The Listener, he was moved to call The Archers radio's own demotic Iliad. Jonathan Rayburn.
I don't think that any piece of radio fiction has ever quite so persuaded the nation that what goes on inside it is literally real, from the death of Grace Archer back in the 1950s, through the amazing row which ran on in the columns of The Guardian and elsewhere about whether George Barford and Christine could get married in church since George Barford was a divorcee, with the Bishop of Exeter writing protesting letters to The Guardian about whether it was suitable for a divorced man to be married in the church at Ambridge, or indeed, most recently, the sense almost of national loss at the death of Doris Archer. And this is a radio serial which is capable of persuading people all over the country that what is going on inside it is real, and yet it achieves this by the most extraordinarily stylized technique. I think it's much closer to that of magazine programs like Today and Woman's Hour. In other words, it's a sort of fruit compote of snippets of news and gossip and romantic storytelling and technical agricultural information and marvellous purple essaylets on the state of the countryside in December and that sort of thing.
And what does lecturer in Byzantine history at Lancaster University, Geoffrey Richards, see in it?
Very important, I think, and increasingly important, is the role of the serial in the provision of ready-made gossip. Because in the increasingly depersonalised society which we live in, the world of tower blocks and lack of communication between people and between families, there is a need for bits and pieces of gossip and other people's lives to be observed and commented on. And this seems to me to explain, for instance, the success of Crossroads. Nothing else could explain the success of Crossroads. That particularly does. And it's also a feature of the appeal of the Archers, I think. And most important, the element of ritual. In that, the Archers, in its storylines, reinforces social norms, provides reassurance with fixed points in a changing world, and, very importantly, organises the fragmented and haphazard events of everyone's ordinary life into a satisfying pattern, so that life is concentrated into 15 minutes every evening, and life rises and falls in an understandable curve. And this was particularly true of the death of Doris Archer, which was widely pre-publicised and brought a satisfying climax to the Brookfield saga of that particular generation. Not the heartbreaking, but the, in a sense, satisfying climax to that story.
Well, not all of us might agree about that. Both the editor of the Archers, William Smethurst, and the head of radio in Birmingham, Jock Gallagher, say the death of Doris was inevitable. Gwen Berryman, the actress who's played her from the beginning, back in January 1951, is ill and can go on no longer. But it does seem to me that there's a great hole in the Archer's fabric now she's gone. No single central point of family reference anymore. Still, the Archers has survived many deaths, both real and fictional, in the past, and I've no doubt that, in time, the strands of story will knit up again. There's a writing team of 8, and they're allowed great freedom in how they move the story and the characters along, while weaving in the farming stuff and keeping the script in line with what's happening in the world. Politics have caused the odd spot of trouble for the Archers in the past, and they still do, as we found out when we eavesdropped on the writing and production team at a recent script conference.
I don't think there's ever been a balance with it, a political balance.
Well, that was because we didn't overtly get involved in politics.
No,
we absolutely, positively avoided politics.
But is there a balance
Therefore,
in
the
the
need for balance.
countryside?
Sorry?
Is there a balance for political views in the
That's
countryside?
a different and difficult question, actually, Helen, and unfortunately it's not totally relevant to what we're talking about, actually, because we have to be wider and more delicate than that.
I think what the programme has got to think very strongly about all the time is reflecting as honestly as we possibly can what goes on in a Midland English village. I think that's the only safety we've got when trying to fight between all these different factions and people wanting us to represent different things. Is this what is actually happening out there? As long as we're an accurate reflection, then the Archers can be seen in later years as a reasonable social history.
No, I'm afraid that's not enough, actually, because which English village would you pick to be representative of? I mean, I could take you to a dozen country pubs. 6 of them. No, I couldn't take you to 6 dozen. No, you could visit a dozen country pubs, and 6 of them would be slightly seedy, and the other 6 would be smart, chic. Now, which is the real country pub?
Oh, they both are. We've got the Bull and the Cat and Fiddle.
Oh, yes. Where is the Cat and Fiddle, please?
It's on the Borchester Road, I think, isn't it? Is it the Hobbiton Road?
Well, there you are. You see, you have to start and ask yourself where the hell the Cat and Fiddle is.
I've looked at the map in front of one of the 2 new volumes of Archer's history, and sure enough, the Cat and Fiddle isn't on it. But on the team, one that's changed considerably since it began with Godfrey Bazley, Edward J. Mason, Geoffrey Webb and Tony Shryan all those years ago, they still take such detail very seriously indeed. The present editor, who was a scriptwriter and whose diploma in tractor driving hangs on his office wall, is William Smethurst.
If it has an editorial policy at all, it is that the Archers has a vaguely optimistic view of life, and that in itself may be slightly old-fashioned. I believe myself quite firmly that it does represent, it provides a dramatic outlet for a large body of opinion which doesn't have an outlet anywhere else, but it is quite genuine. Life for a lot of people is rather nice. They believe that life is good, that most people are good-natured. I think that a majority of people in this country think that life is a good thing, in quotes. There are generally optimistic about it. They believe that human nature is good rather than bad. Whereas the general broad strand of dramatic output in both television and radio tends to adopt the opposite point of view. A large number of plays, particularly in the sort of play of today category, tend to look at the less pleasant side of life. We tend to look at the more pleasant side of life. I see no reason why we are any worse than they are or any less real.
Real in its own particular way, it certainly is to those of us who are addicts. But it does change at its own pace and within distinct limits, as Jonathan Rayburn has noticed.
What is going on now as I talk, for instance, is that the church under Richard the Vicar is becoming more and more central to the society of the Archers at the very moment where it's becoming less and less central to the state of English society at large. And the working class, in the shape of Joe and Eddie Grundy, is drawing to the centre of the story, being admitted, as it were, to the privileged society of the centre of Ambridge, just as the rich, like Brown, for instance, are unbending and moving more and more closely in from the other side. In other words, it's presenting a society, a vision of a society, which is getting more and more unified day by day. Class divisions are being eradicated now and out, and everybody's, moving on to better and better things in terms of their relationships with each other. While out in the real world, I think we're living in a period of more intense and dangerous class division than we've probably known at any time since before the last war. But in Ambridge, for instance, a whole day was given just a few days ago to the question of whether young Adam, whom I find a absolutely intolerable little prig myself, was going to pass his common entrance and get to Sherborne. And the whole village crowded round to see the outcome of his examination results. Universal applause from people of all classes when it was announced that Adam was going to be able to go to a fee-paying private school. Now, this is very, very odd indeed. I think much, much more effectively than Mrs. Thatcher's speeches or Ronald Reagan's speeches, the Archers embodies that ideal pastoral vision of the new Christian right. It's a vision with which I've got no sympathy at all. I find its version of society both unbelievable and in certain kinds of ways dangerous because totally smug. And yet I'm totally hooked on this programme as a listener. And I'm fascinated by the power it has to make me an addicted participant of a fantasy of which in many ways I morally profoundly disapprove.
Now that's rather a good example of the way in which all Archers listeners find themselves from time to time in total disapproval of what's going on, and yet, as Jonathan Rayburn said, there we are, hooked. What makes a feminist like Micheline Wander listen?
I'm fascinated by the whole kind of family structure, its good and its bad sides, and the things that it represents as a kind of I don't know, it's like a substitute family life. I mean, how many people actually have that sort of supportive, critical network of family, let alone friends, that keep them going? I think if I have a kind of favourite obsession, it's really with the whole idea of the family and what their relationships are about in the Archers.
How realistic do you think that family is, though?
I think it's probably pretty unrealistic, actually. I think there must be very, very few families who could live that close to each other and really sustain the kind of commitment that they have without something blowing. I mean, there's never been any kind of real black sheep. People always get integrated back in. And in some ways, I think that idealism is a kind of fascination in a way. I think it represents a kind of hope. You know, it's something you would either always go on wanting from your family or go on wanting a substitute similar thing from friends in some kind of way.
You don't think it's possible to change it radically, but just say you could. How would you do it?
Well, I think Jennifer's situation cries out for something more. I think the future of the younger Archers would be quite interesting to develop in a direction that took a slightly more real account of the way life in the country has changed in the last 30 years. And that means Jennifer's children. It means Shula, David. Maybe when Kenton comes back, something will explode. I think it's probably the younger generation, plus the odd hangovers from the older generation.
We do all play about with the characters in our own minds. A friend of mine has worked out how Shula will marry Neil. I don't see that at all, and I certainly don't want Clary to marry Eddie Grundy. She's far too good for him. But Susan Hill, as an Archers writer, has had the chance to influence all their destinies. Was there much of a difference in her attitudes as a writer as opposed to a listener?
I think it stayed pretty much as I had felt it as a listener. I think I got to know better and developed myself and felt were more interesting the characters I'd already liked.
Who are they?
Philip and Jill and that marriage of theirs, which is just rather taken for granted now. I mean, they've been married, I don't know, 25 years or something, and it's got rather... I think people in middle life, I mean, I find them very interesting. I'm not frightfully interested in the younger set. I don't know why. This is an admission of failure in me. Dan and Doris, alas, the late Doris, I liked writing for very much. The country characters. I like writing for Tom Forrest because I love getting in the country scenes. I was very keen on writing for the pub couple, Sid and Polly Perks. Now, they're often thought of as wallpaper characters. They just say, another half coming up, Mr. Forrest, and that's just right, thank you, and I'll give you your change. They are, in fact, an extremely interesting couple with a very fascinating past. And I loved writing for Sid and Polly, especially Sid. I mean, he's a marvellous character, and you could do wonderful comic things with Sid. And he's always having bright ideas that don't work. They are a very rich source. I could have written for them a lot more than I did. Wasn't very keen on the Grundys, and so it goes on. I mean, the ball shuffles around.
Why do you think that everybody has favourite characters in the Archers when they're listening to them, and that you will stick with them, even though they change in quite particular ways?
I just don't know. It's very difficult to tell why, when a certain character like that wretched policeman is introduced, does everybody loathe him? I mean, it became a national pastime, loathing Jim Coverdale.
Oh, but Jim Coverdale started off as quite a different character from the way he ended up, I think. I
Yes.
mean, Jim Coverdale started off, I thought, as being a potential fiancé for Shula.
Ah.
And then he changed and married Ava.
Now, see, this is what happens with new characters, relatively new characters to the series. They are not long established and long developed like Philip and Jill and Dan and Walter. And you are changing them rather more. I mean, no writer is going to be able to change Walter, however hard they try, because it would stick out like a sore thumb. If you suddenly made Walter into a totally different character one week, it wouldn't get past the script editors because it wouldn't ring true. A new character like Jim Coverdale or Ava, nobody quite knows them yet. So everybody does something with them that they think is right, and it all either grows together or it doesn't, and I don't think Jim Coverdale ever did. You see, I suddenly made Jim Coverdale go out sketching, and everybody said in the end, oh, that didn't work. I mean, you're not going to have a policeman like him going out sketching the village church. And I agree now, it actually didn't seem right, but this is how characters grow, and I just don't think he ever gelled.
Well, Shula and David have to gel because they're the young generation of the Archers, given that Kenton's always away at sea, and will he ever come home, I ask myself. But what's going to happen to Shula and David? Because there doesn't appear to be a suitable match in store within Ambridge for either of them.
Now, if I were writing now, which I'm not, so I can speak boldly and freely, I mean, there are no plans for me to do any more Archer scripts. David I don't know about. I mean, he's lumbered with taking over the farm, isn't he? But you see, Doris Archer left her cottage in trust for Dan, and then she left it to Shula. And I think that the line I would like to see developed over Shula is for Shula to become a very independent, I don't mean just a career girl, I don't mean she must never get married, but I really do think that Shula is likely to do something with part of the farm or with the cottage. I mean, she might, I don't know what. She's going to be the kind of, rather than just David being the man and the rest of the family being sidelines, I rather like to think of the future Archers, owners and farmers as being Shula and David.
Shula, you will of course remember, has been going through a bit of a bad patch lately. Her current boyfriend, Mark, a solicitor, has not been very pleased with Phil's performance as a magistrate in the case of some hunt saboteurs, and Shula has brought her troubles back to the kitchen at Brookfield.
Shula?
At last!
Hello. Sorry I'm late.
I couldn't think where you'd got to. I put the potatoes on.
I got caught at Peggy's.
And I've got broad beans out of the freezer. I know David doesn't like broad beans. But if we don't start eating them soon, we'll still have a freezer full next summer.
The most amazing things seem to be happening at Grange Farm.
They always did.
Yes. What's the matter?
Nothing.
Oh. Aunt Laura's decided to forgive Freddie. You know, about the pickled walnuts. Of course, there's no actual proof that he ever did eat them.
But that needn't stop him being transported for life, need it? Not around here.
Shula?
Oh, sorry. I had to go and see Mark this afternoon. He's convinced those hunt saboteurs are innocent.
And you think he's right?
How should I know? I wasn't there. They did have spray paint. They were there to start trouble. Perhaps they deserve everything they got.
Oh, I don't know about that. There's nothing wrong with being anti-blood sports.
Mark's convinced that they were making a peaceful protest and were deliberately run down. He's hopping mad about what Dad said in court. He's talking to the papers.
Oh, dear.
I've never seen him so angry.
Whatever is your father going to say?
Patricia Green as Jill and Judy Bennett as Shula. And I've got another friend who seems to remember that Phil was a hunt saboteur in his day, and she can't understand why Phil doesn't remember it himself. Still, the great new cult figures in the Archers are the tenants of Grange Farm, the Grundys, Naughty Old Joe and doughty son Eddie. They represent the rougher side of Ambridge, with Joe always up to some crafty dodge and Eddie usually ending up in a mess. I can't stand the Grundys, but Geoffrey Richards is of quite a different mind.
The Grundys seem to me to be absolutely crucial to the Archers. They provide a vital and much-needed antidote to the earnest middle-class do-gooding of the likes of the Vicar and the WI and the Ambridge Protection Society and the Historic Landscape Survey. And I think that one of the important facts of the increasing success of the Archers is the moving of the Grundys to centre stage. A serial, if it's going to have life and permanence, has to have a touch of villainy to counterpoint the goodness. The success of J.R. in Dallas, the phenomenal success there, is a clear indication of the importance of villainy. Eddie Grundy's villainy is of a different sort. Eddie is the, I think, rural equivalent of Jed Stone in Coronation Street. He was, if you remember, the wide boy, the petty criminal, very lovable, but always involved in schemes which never quite made it. And Eddie is the rural version of Jed Stone. He's also a grown-up Just William. He's cheeky, he's sexy, he's roguish, but with an endearing touch of naivety. And his constant battles with his father Joe, who is both reprobate and curmudgeon, provide a very important comic strand to the stories, it seems to me. They are beautifully vocalised parts. The characterisation of the actors, Trevor Harrison and Hayden Jones, is absolutely precise. One gets an immediate mental image of these two characters, which remains indelible, I think, as you hear their voices. And also, the writers provide them with marvellous dialogue. One of my favourite lines of Eddie's quite recently was, "He'll be as chuffed as a bowl of badger fat," which seems to be an absolutely wonderful thing to say. And they make the most of this and become an important centre at Grange Farm as a counterpoint to Home Farm and the other centres of goodness and excellence. Though there are occasions when, after a particularly trying episode, when the characters have all been whittering on about whether Adam's going to get into Sherborne or something, I'm sometimes seized by the desire to see the marvellous Tony Hancock parody, The Bowmans, brought into reality, in which old Joshua Merriweather is written out of the series, comes back by popular demand and takes over the series with an episode in which the whole population of Ambridge walk across the field, fall down a mine shaft, and the series is renamed The Merriweathers. And I wonder if perhaps for the future we might not think of the Grundys, an everyday story of country rogues, because they do fulfil an absolutely vital function, it seems to me, in the Ambridge community.
Turn it down a bit, it's much too fierce.
That better?
Nah, not much, but it'll have to do. Not over there, Eddie, it'll just make it worse.
Well, that's where most of it got spilt.
So we don't want to push any more over to join it, do we, you great half-beaten nit?
Shows it's good shampoo, though, don't it? Puffing like that.
Can I turn the tap off now?
All it shows is what a pair of ninnies you are. Yeah, go on, turn it off.
Can I go and make some coffee now, Mr. Grundy? I'm perished.
Oh, that's good for your soul.
If you was to get a proper connector for that tap, I wouldn't have to stand there holding the hosepipe on all the time, getting soaked with the drips.
Mortification of the flesh. You got cold hands, I got Eddie.
Oh, we've said sorry. How many times
You
we have
can
to
say it till you're blue in the face.
I already am.
And I'll believe it. When there ain't a drop of soap left in the yard, and we all stop stinking like an harem bathroom.
Makes the place smell authentic if any of our customers was to drop by.
Oh, it does, it does. We're the sweetest smelling farmers in the Midlands. Andrew Sinclair's going to be dead impressed if he drops by.
I didn't think of that.
Oh, you surprise me.
I wish you wouldn't go on at him like that. It was my idea.
What you will learn, Clary, as time goes by, is not to give Eddie ideas. He can't cope with them.
The Grundys of Ambridge, with Heather Bell as the long-suffering Clary. Well, perhaps it will turn out all right for them this time. At least that'd make a change. But we Archers fans don't like an awful lot of change all at once. We hated it when the omnibus got moved to Sunday evening, and then we moaned when they moved it back to Sunday mornings. It's taken me ages to get used to the new Aunt Laura, and I've only just started believing in the new Colonel Danby. Can we look forward to another 30 years? And if we can, what will they be like? Susan Hill.
I think what I want to happen is, sounds boring, is for the Archers to carry on in the same way as it has carried on for 30 years, and yet not get stuck in the mud, and this is the most difficult thing of all. I think I want them to bring in the new generation carefully, so that they, as you say, their characters in another 30 years will be as believable and well-established and interesting and many-sided as Dan and Doris and Walter and Mrs. Perkins and Philip and Jill have now become. And this is going to be very difficult. I also want to get rid of a few characters, but perhaps we better not go into that.
But can it go on for another 30 years? Micheline Wander.
I think it can. I see absolutely no reason why it can't. I mean, I would hope that certain things would be treated differently, but that's because of, you know, my ideas and what I get out of it and what situations I get annoyed at or, you know, what things I'm fascinated by. But I see absolutely no reason why it shouldn't.
Being annoyed with a situation has never made you turn it off, though, and stop listening?
Oh, no. Never.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's that kind of fascination and obsession that I've got with something that's a serial, where there's so much of the story is in my head, even though, as I say, I haven't listened to absolutely every single episode, that it's like a continuing piece of fiction that sparks off enough connections with certain aspects of real life to make me go on wanting to know. I always want to know.
And for those who are positively insatiable about knowing more, there are 2 new books out. The Archers, The First 30 Years by William Smethurst, published by Eyre Methuen at £5.95, and Forever Ambridge, 30 Years of the Archers by Norman Painting, who we all know both as Bruno Milner, who used to write Archers scripts, and as Master Phil, father of the Phantom Kenton, the Solid David and the Romantic Shula. That's from Michael Joseph at £6.95. Neither will tell you whether Shula will marry Mark. For that, you'll just have to keep listening. And so, come to think of it, will I.
Kaleidoscope on the Archers was presented by Gillian Reynolds and produced by Brian Barfield. And you can hear the 30th anniversary edition of the Archers at 7:05 tomorrow evening here on Radio 4.